paper. Go and find my pen for drawing with. Hi there. I am Chris from Airwindows, and we're doing another live chat as I like to do on Mondays. Hey Zachary. So, what shall we do? I'm going to get my chat window and stuff going. Hey Bo. And like you may see, I have the title on the stream as What Do We Make? Because this is a question that is on my mind at the moment regarding on Sunday, the thing that I made was a plugin, and I put out Slew 3. And Slew 3 is a new form of slew clipping, which I think may well be useful. The big question that I've got is the tone of Slew 3 better than the original Slew at low settings? Because the thing about it is I can do Slew, and in fact I had a version of Slew in, for instance, Channel, and one of the people, a quick answer, Dudecraft, I stopped doing Minecraft streams. I'm not playing games anymore. I'm all work all the time. But the thing about updating Slew is my hope is that it'll work better with regard to these moderate settings. Yeah. Just a moment. I'm fooling with my cameras just a little bit. Hey, Samantha. Hello, everybody. Oh, somebody's trying Counterpart. Neat. I'm glad it runs in your machine. Don't try streaming it. It has the worst visuals for trying to stream imaginable. I can explain why that is, but never stream Counterpart. It is just it'll make you very sad with how much worse it looks. Now, Bo is asking about Slew 2 as a low pass to avoid aliasing. Well, the thing is that it doesn't roll off quite. If you really wanted to obliterate aliasing, what you would be doing is, I think, depending upon what kind of distortion you're producing, you'd have a brick wall filter going down to about half the Nyquist frequency. So if you could brick wall filter everything above 11K at CD quality rate, and then you had a generation of distortion elements that only gave you, see, here's the thing, is if you were generating only second harmonic, that being exactly twice the frequency of the note that you were at, then, and you filtered that, then you'd be fine. I think, here, let me grab a calculator. So, yeah, third harmonic. If you were running at like CD quality and you were generating just the first distortion harmonic from something like density or whatever, some very gentle distortion generator, you would need to filter at 7.35K, 7,350 hertz. And if you perfectly did that, and then ran through your third harmonic generator, you would end up having literally no aliasing, because there would be no frequencies above this that would come through. And of course, another possibility is doing something like Focus does, which is you're wanting to generate a overtone and you're wanting absolutely no aliasing. So what you do is a brick wall filter and then just let all of the higher frequencies through untouched and cut off at 7.35K. And below that, be sure to generate just a single harmonic at a single third harmonic. And if you do that, it should be aliasing free. Also, as a side effect, if you're running at 96K, then your cutoff is 16K, so that's interesting. That more than suggests with normal sounds that aren't like really aggressive cymbals, what you'll have at 96K is the third harmonic being generated by simple distortion things. Nothing in the audio range is particularly going to cause a problem for you. So that's interesting. And again, I'm having to divide it by 3 because simple clipping with a soft clip function is going to start generating harmonics one by one. And the first harmonic it's going to generate, if it is symmetrical, is a third harmonic. And then you push it a little farther, you get lots of third harmonic, and then you start getting fifth harmonic. You push that farther, and then you start getting seventh harmonic, and so on and so forth. They increase the harder you're clipping things, even in the smoothest soft clip that you can get, because it's the more amplitude going into it, the sharper soft clip it is relative to the amount of signal being clipped. So I'm pretty sure how that works out. So yeah, questions and things. And like I said, I have a rather large topic of what do we make. Because I'm going into a situation where, like, you might have noticed I didn't do music streams either. And I'm not expecting that this week because I'm doing some sort of maintenance. Actually, there's a lot of maintenance. One of the things I was talking about last week was how I had gotten in a dumpster because I need to clear out my basement for the purpose of readying it for being able to get hardware stuff and start moving into that kits of hardware that I can get into people's hands for very cheaply. I have put a lot of effort into designing ways that people can do what I did. And that being, when I was younger, I was really into soldering together stuff with CMOS chips. I started with Craig Anderton's Electronic Projects for Musicians. And it's interesting about that because that book had a bunch of really fancy circuits. I need to find another copy of it somewhere. It would be great. And some of the things that you could theoretically make were actually problematic or difficult because there were things like stuff. Now I'm very curious to dig into this again. He had a phase shifter in there. And it was thought to be very difficult because you couldn't get the part, and the part was a Vactrol. And now I know that a Vactrol is nothing but an LED and a CDS cell, and I have dozens of CDS cells kicking around and can get them as well. The deal with the Vactrol is that he wanted to use exactly the right kind for predictable behavior, but the other thing about Vactrols is you can get your behavior in various ways. It doesn't have to always be doing it by getting exactly the right kind of CDS cell and light so that it natively produces the behavior you want. You can also produce, like, the ping effect, some some CDS cells, you hit them with light, and then they only return to the original resistance rather slowly, and that's thought to be a nice sounding envelope. But you can also make the light do that. You don't have to make the CDS cell do that. You can make the light do that, meaning, yeah, the reason the Vactrol was in the phaser was because he was running LFOs to however many stages of the phaser, and the Vactrols were controlling amplitude of all-pass filters, which is the other thing, is like, now I want to know how you make an all-pass filter in hardware, because clearly he was doing it. And I'm not quite up to speed on what that is, but I can imagine that being useful. So before I get off on this direction of what do we make, let me scan over the chat again. And I'm loving that somebody's enjoying Counterpart. That is not the only game I will ever make. It's just that I don't generally have time to do any of those things. And I will see about there's something else that I could put out. It's been taking a back seat to plugins a lot. But I have another game based on Godot, and that touches on my topic for today, actually. Slew2, to glance up at the chat, it's a low pass for sure, not necessarily to avoid aliasing, but it'll clean up some behavior like that. So you could call it, like, it will restrict to some extent the aliasing that you get. Not completely, but it'll doctor the tone a little bit. And you could do the same trick of, this is why I'm so interested in modular synths. You can do the same trick that Focus does of, run Slew2 and then subtract the result from the original and keep that sort of delicate, super high stuff that is taken away by Slew2, and through subtracting it, then you have that as the other part and can sneak it back in again or something. There's stuff like that that I'm likely to be doing when I get into guitar style things, because guitar really needs to have the texture on it as well as the clipping and distortion. And I feel like being able to do the texture through retaining some of those highs through gain stages, it won't be super effective, but it's probably better than nothing. And the other side of that is, if you're emulating speaker cabinets, it doesn't completely whack the super highs, but you do wind up producing that stuff. So many questions, but yeah, that's the thing, Bo, is using Slew2, you do get a really nifty little roll-off, which was quite accidental. I never designed it that way. But that is at literally the Nyquist frequency, and you needed to have it be at half the Nyquist frequency to do aliasing prevention stuff, or a third of the Nyquist frequency, rather. And if you were to just sort of bit crush the frequency and then do it, which is an interesting thought, I've never tried doing that, you would lose the effectiveness of what you were doing, if I'm not mistaken. Like, if you simply bit crush the sample rate in order to get the lower rate that you could then run Slew2 on, you've already generated all the aliasing, so it's wasting your time. Emma has a quick question on piano, and I'm not really I don't know that much about temperament. I've just played with it a little bit, and not really with the stuff that I currently do. So I would say the reason piano and equal temperament doesn't sound very good compared to whatever you apparently prefer, it's not so much the overtone series as much as it is equal temperament is equally out of tune in every possible direction. like overtone series, that's going to relate to the way in which piano strings, especially the bass strings, not so much the high strings, have a great deal of metal cylinder behavior rather than just stretched elastic thing behavior. And this is why their overtones, if I remember correctly, the overtones go a little sharp, although I could be wrong, so don't quote me on that one. Or if you do, I'll just look silly. But I do know that the overtones of the lower strings at the piano are not in tune with the fundamental note, so you do have to doctor the tuning a little bit so that the instrument in general will sound in tune. It's stretched, it's pulled in a particular direction, and that's because the internal harmonics of the string are not all in tune with each other. That's not related to equal temperament, though. That would be the same stretch whether you were doing equal temperament or whether you were doing some kind of just intonation or whatever. Equal temperament is like, Bach doing the well-tempered clavier kind of thing. I think that was his. I could be mistaken, but I think that was his. There's a lot of stuff I apparently don't know today. And the idea of equal temperament is that you can then transpose everything all around. You're playing a thing, and then suddenly you're playing the thing in 5 sharps or whatever, or you're chromatically modulating through everything, and every time you reach a new chromatic key center, the notes that you're playing sound the same as they did in the other key center, and that's what equal temperament is about. So if you were writing in some weird combination of sharps and flats, and you expected your melody and harmonies to behave the way they normally would, you'd need equal temperament, because that would give you exactly the same formulation that you had in just C. Now, the deal with the other temperaments is that you can stretch and doctor stuff around a little bit so that if you're in a known key, like you're doing just intonation in C major, and you play in that, and all of the harmonies are more sonorous, they resonate more nicely, so long as you stay in C major. That's what unusual temperaments are about. It's about favoring a particular key and being something that works reasonably well in other keys. So there's all manner of different temperaments that you can use. Like, I believe there's a Werkmeister, and of course just intonation is a very simple form of temperament where I think it's fourths, maybe I shouldn't just run my brain on stuff that I don't know sufficiently well. But yep, it is all of the temperaments other than equal temperament are about favoring some key and having a kind of harmoniousness that is greater than you would have in equal temperament. And which is also another reason why stuff like synthesizers and like my modular stuff and whatever. And indeed, this also holds for stuff like VCV Rack. If you're doing stuff from raw oscillators and you're having to tune everything, it's very easy to get more harmonious than equal temperament, assuming you're trying to get harmonious in the first place, by just tuning things until the beating frequencies sound right. And you may very well be in no known temperament at all, but you might be doing a melodious, or rather harmonious. Melodious could be anything. Harmonious means multiple notes that are resonating with each other nicely. These are ways of getting past just straight up equal temperament. Equal temperament is something like, for instance, MIDI instruments, synthesizers, stuff like that is very likely to be based on equal temperament. Guitar fretboards are based on equal temperament, unless you have one of the funky guitars with the frets all just very slightly offset, So you can get a different temperament going on. But as far as piano not sounding very good, the overtone series thing is, and I'm reiterating a little bit because I'm about to let go of this topic. The reason that the overtone series matters is because that changes the tuning of low notes relative to high notes. Temperament has nothing to do with this. It's a matter of how you're going to tune 4 octaves down. And that would be a problem or a kind of thing that you have to deal with regardless of which temperament you chose, because all of the low notes would be out the same amount regardless of which note it was. There's probably a degree of that in things like an electric bass that has a big heavy core winding, assuming for values of electric bass that do have a big heavy core winding. So yeah, Bo's quickly asking, how does slew work and can you use it as a brick wall low pass? Nope. It is a slew clipper. It has nothing to do with a brick wall low pass. In fact, if you look at its behavior, you can see that it's a shelf. And the reason it's a shelf is it's not really a filter at all. This came up, somebody was talking about slew 3, and they were like, this is cool, but it's generating a lot of distortion. And I'm like, yeah, it's a slew clipper. It's not an EQ at all. So that's kind of what you get when you have a slew clipper, is there is clippings. And it's not going to behave in any way like a brick wall filter or even a typical kind of filter. Zachary Clark confirms that when you do extremely huge bass strings, you start getting overtones in the strings that are not in tune with the fundamental note. Neat. And that is also something that we can do stuff in synthesis to emulate. Like if you're inventing like an FM sound and you're designing the overtones that it has to resemble things like and maybe Zachary, you can answer this question while we're going, is since you discovered that, did you find that the higher notes were sharp, or the higher harmonics were sharp? Because I thought that's with how that worked, that the higher harmonics went a little sharp when your railroad track strings were huge metal cylinders with some wrappings around them. So yeah, the thing about the way slew functions is it's the literal opposite of a brick wall filter. And you can see that in the video where as it kicks in, it just kind of makes this flat space that takes over the slope of the white noise. And it just curves off and then continues curving off, and you just have a pile of noise and clip at the bottom of it. So that's interesting. This is one of the reasons why I'm looking to get some reactions as far as its use in very low settings. And I noticed, having already posted it, actually no, I was making the video so I hadn't posted it yet, having already made it and just coded it and packaged everything up, I noticed when I threw white noise at it that I was immediately getting an effect turning it on even when it was set to 0, which is interesting and not really quite what I expected, but that's Airwindows plugins for you. And got my unusual behavior out of it. And what I'm looking to find out is whether the very low settings are doing musically useful things for normal music, like drum tracks and such. Can you get a magical tone out of having a really bright tizzy cymbal track or something like that, and then hitting that with slew 3, but at a very low to 0 setting, something very small? That's relevant because what's following this up, unless something terrible goes wrong, is, of course, a new version of channel. The version of channel that has the update to the tone shaping stuff that I did on capacitor 2 on its very subtle high passing, and the update in slew 3 on its slew clipping, and then the same gain situation, the same distortion situation out of the previous version of channel that goes to spiral at 50% and then fades from spiral to density algorithm at 100%. So naturally I'm interested as to whether that's going to be great or whether that's going to throw unexpected problems at me. The thing is, if the criticism is, yeah, I'm getting obvious distortion when I put it to a setting of like 0.6 or 0.7, it's like, yeah, so did the original slew. That's just what that does. It may work around it more interestingly, but it's still a slew clipper. So it's still going to produce a very aggressive effect in that way. And I should probably make a note to myself of the slew soft clipper. Because that's the thing, is it's time for me to revisit slew and see whether I can throw the density or spiral algorithm onto the actual clipping factor of it. It seems like it should be possible. I just haven't tried it, so I'm not sure quite how that's going to work. But I'll see whether I can do something about it. It seems as if that might be a positive. And one thing about it is, if it worked, and if it became possible to, so probably what you'd have to do is scale the clip factor from nothing to the point at which it is clipping. Oh, yeah, fair enough. Zachary confirms that the higher overtones are likely to go sharp. That sounds like what I remember. That sounds plausible. So, yeah. So I'm thinking to do this clip thing. What we're currently doing is, if the clip goes beyond this point, it just gets stuck there. Like, here's my audio, and the next sample is over here, but it clamps it to here, and then this is where we go from the next time, and it's going to continue to try to track. So you wind up, if you have a very small clip amount, you wind up getting this slower wave just because you're only allowing a certain amount of clip. And what we'd be wanting to do is some form of soft clip where at these lower settings, rather than, if something here gets clipped back to this, something here might get clipped back to this. And that's how a soft clip works, and that will cut off some of the grunge. It will cut back some of the harshness that you get from there, and it might make it more usable in heavily clipped or moderately clipped setting. No, heavily clipped would be correct, because I run into the problem with slew original when it's being pushed really far. So the thing about it is, if I can get something like that to work, it's still not going to act quite like an EQ. It's still going to be a form of grunge. It'll just be a softer, smoother grunge. And if I'm understanding it correctly, what that's going to mean is the behavior is still going to be more like a shelf rather than a cutoff. You're never going to be able to sweep it down, but I might be able to make it sort of a hump of frequency response behavior. If the grind going way up into the highs is mostly about slew clipping being an obvious clip, then these are things I'm simply going to have to try out. I'm going to have to get in there and start fooling with it again. So yeah, I have called this day's Q&A, What Do We Make? Because I can do stuff like make plugins, and people do seem to like them to a point, and I'll sometimes make music. Sometimes it seems like this is very cool. Sometimes it feels very lacking. I don't spend a lot of time doing that. I can make games and things. Like the Counterpart. It's delightful to hear that somebody's playing with that. I don't find a lot of time to do those things. And I tend to be very aware of like my user base and what you have available. Like I have found that I haven't had a lot of fascination compared to some people on YouTube with people wanting me to show you all about like my modular synth stuff. And this is different from, like, for instance, Ricky Tines. I love Ricky Tines's visuals, and I think it's interesting when he talks about stuff. He has reviewed some modular things that were so persuasive that I got one and found it useful. And his people love it when he goes and looks at some kind of expensive new gear or whatever. I don't find that my crew is interested in that. And I feel that the reason is it's not about gawking at me playing with some kind of fancy thing. I'm not the DJ. I'm not a notable producer. It is about making tools that people can actually have. And I am able to reach people on YouTube and in Gearslots and so on, where they are limited in resource, but they can run things like a DAW or VCV Rack and stuff like that. And I've gotten a certain amount of interest in my plans to get kits of chips and things and designing ways for people to wire stuff together like I did when I was younger with that Craig Anderton stuff. I did a bunch of interesting stuff with 4049 chips, and indeed I have more 4049 chips now than of any other kind. They're this little FET-based hex inverters, unbuffered inverters. And you can use them as a sort of fuzzy 2B style amp with a very characteristic distortion. And I ended up building all kinds of circuits based on that. I ended up building a circuit where every single stage of the 4049 was wired up and distorting every other stage. 6 stages of distortion, all with very small capacitors wiring them together into this little jewel of a chip. And basically it just screamed. I can show you how to make one of those. I can see doing that as a live stream or something. It's like, hey, let's make one of these things. I used to call it the Fiend. And you wire it together, and you plug the battery onto it, and plug a guitar into it, and you can use it as a guitar distortion. But if you stop playing, it just immediately starts shrieking and screaming in this very characteristic way. And that was fun. I think other people should get to play with stuff like that. And what do we make? It's a big question as to what kinds of stuff can we get. Here's another example. Is I can talk about that, but I also, since I need to get my YouTube jam going and have like the cameras and the switcher and stuff like that, for upping the level of my game and communicating to people in such a way that I'm heard on a larger scale, I end up looking at things like YouTube videos about lenses and cameras and stuff. And man, a lot of those things are just straight up, hey, these people gave me this wonderful camera and let me do a advertisement about how great the thing is or whatever. Or if they're slightly more popular, oh, hey, this is not actually an advertisement, but they did send me this thing, and so let's do an actual review of it. But you wind up with the situation where it's like, this is this pile of wealthy people that are reviewing cameras and lenses and stuff like that, and their world is all about like, oh, here's the most refined camera, and this is the most refined caviar, and this is the most refined car, or whatever. And I don't necessarily see them doing artistically great stuff with that stuff. Whereas when I was putting together basic chips and things, I found that interesting. So part of what's in my mind in this sort of fallback and reconnoiter kind of thing, where I do plugins because that's what I always do. But I do also wonder what kinds of stuff would catch on as far as extra things. And I have this feeling that from me, people can relate to stuff that they can have and fool with at no cost. So I wonder about things like, would you be interested in learning about, say, Blender? If I was doing 3D modeling in Blender, which is very daunting and difficult to get into, but doable, and they've improved it in recent years, and it is a free open source program, like my stuff is free open source stuff. Or how about the Godot engine, the Godot game engine? I've done some stuff in that, and the thing that I'm getting together is, once I get the audio side of it sorted, I'll have another little game to put out, and it's not likely to go anywhere. I'm not going to have a successful game out of this, but I learned some stuff, and it's better, and it's a typical Airwindows thing. It's like, okay, I'm not sure whether I like this or not, but it's sure not like anybody else's thing, and I've got a game like that. I was working on the concept of how do you gamify not being able to keep track of large numbers of things? And so here's how this game works. It's also almost like a typing tutor game. You've got these little balls, these little dots, sort of bouncing around on a screen with obstacles, and the goal is that they need to go up off the top of the screen, past the obstacles. So you use arrow keys. This was also because I had troubles making the mouse particularly usable in Counterpart. You had to have the right kind of mouse. Otherwise, it was just awkward, and I didn't have my chops together enough to have a mouse sensitivity setting available. So I ended up with tailoring it to my own setup, and then even if I played it on other people's systems, the mice usually just balked me and it didn't work properly. So I was like, okay, screw mice, let me do a game in which everything is the keyboard. And you're directing these little balls starting with just the one, A. So you type A on the keyboard to select it, and you use the arrow keys to steer up around whatever obstacles there are off the top of the screen. Ta-da, you win. Next you have A and B. So you have to type A and B respectively to select each particular one. And I went through a whole lot of variations. This is when I was like game coding with my brother Dan, which was very frustrating for both of us. And there was a exploration about using the same technique to select ships modeled. They were supposed to be oil tankers moving slowly in this large scrolling vertical area. And the trouble with that was you could set it up so that different things were moving in the directions that you wanted, but as soon as something was off the screen, you forgot what it was doing and it would just crash. And it wasn't fun. Like steering things and getting them all to work, whatever was going on with it, it wasn't fun. And so I ended up doing just these dots on a single screen that doesn't scroll and you can see all of it. And the idea is just you need to get everything off the top of the screen before the time runs out. So you wind up looking at these things moving around and trying to spot what letter it is and type it to steer the thing that is going exactly the wrong direction and make it turn around and go back up the right direction again. And that's the one that I'm looking to put out, and that's in the Godot engine. So it's like a game concept that I haven't seen everywhere. With the purpose of exploring the idea of challenging people to keep track of many things at once. And probably you could do that with the ship or super tanker style game if it didn't have to be scaled up to where it's like, well, we have 26 letter keys, therefore there has to be 26 objects moving at the same time. 26 is definitely too many things to keep in your head at once, so you wind up breaking it down, chunking it into whatever you can observe, and if stuff is off the screen, you can't observe it, so it's not fun. The moving balls around and getting them off of the top of the screen thing got interesting when it became like a demented pachinko machine. And as the numbers get higher and higher, because if you wrap around, all of a sudden now you have capitalized letters. Now you have to get those going. And then if you wrap around again, you've got multiple instances of any given one. You start having such large numbers of things going around in the screen that it's impossible to manage, and yet it's still better if you can somehow make sense of it. And the idea was to make it in such a way where it would scale up to where you could not complete the level. You'd run out of time, gravity would kick in, and the things would fall down, and it would be over. And I got that working. I just don't have all the chrome and polish and stuff on it to make it be appealing. But functionally, it's already working. I'm just not putting it out because I want to put the chrome on. I even had my other brother check it out. And as is his wont, he immediately found fault with it and was like, this seems neat. This is the things that you should do with it in order to make it be good. And he wanted it to use Star Wars IP so that it could tie in with that. And I'm like, I don't own that. I would just get in trouble. He's like, well, I don't know. This is what you need to do. I'm like, I can't. But that's a whole other story. Point being, Godot engine is also accessible. I think Godot engine is even Mac, Windows, and Linux. And I like it when things are that, like Blender and the Godot engine are all of those things. And it would be nice to have people following along with some of these things. I mean, maybe I've been doing it all wrong. Maybe rather than trying to do this kind of stuff with one or another brother sitting there going, you're doing it all wrong, I need to have the internet there going, you're doing it all wrong. Or at least my crew is such as we have here, and I can do live streams based on that. And if you're interested in watching or following along or doing your own thing, it reminds me a little bit, and this is what I'd like to produce, if I can. It's probably worth working into so that by the time winter comes along, and I'll be like in my Jedi robe again because it'll be cold, and it'll be time to buckle down and spend hours doing things. It would be nice to have something like that rolling that was similar to, because this is a whole other thing, but something that I totally cannot share. I've been interested in animation for a long time, and although that is something that Blender can do, but from some years back, there was a point when I was able to get a hold of Toon Boom. So I actually own a legal copy of Toon Boom with the node editor and everything. And I've seen many animators getting together and doing kind of like online work sessions, and they'll spend like 8 hours animating some kind of scene and just hanging out. And that seems cool. I can't really do that with Toon Boom though, because the problem with that is you guys can't get Toon Boom. It's too damn expensive. But if we were doing like Godot Engine or Blender or something like that, 3D modeling or game making, that is something that could be shared, because that is something where anybody following along could also go and download those open source projects and try thinking of their own thing to do. And if they're confused by a bit, they could jump on the stream or whatever and go, oh, hey, this is happening. Do you know what I should do? And if I knew, I would be like, why, yes, you need to do this. That could be a fun way to spend some time, it seems to me. One of the things I've been moving towards most aggressively is the idea of getting together so that I can have a like switcher and cameras and stuff to effectively do synthesizer building on a stream. And it might not be the kind of thing where the people hanging out on the stream would themselves have a soldering iron and chips and stuff, although that'd be pretty cool. I'm not going to lie, that's one of the reasons I'd like to get these parts into people's hands, is so that people can get together and we can all sort of hang out and jam out on synthesizer making. But I've been moving pretty aggressively towards being able to support that. Like, I've got my cameras and stuff, and I've recently moved. Hopefully this will work. Yep. I might even be able to get this on shop, but this is why I would need another camera. Can you see this? It's still plugged in. If I turn this on, the light will come on, which I am far from sure you can see, but this is a little tip cleaner. Here's my solder. I have a big old rubber band holding it on so it doesn't all unravel. And my soldering iron, which I can park here, turn on. It's a good enough soldering iron that it does a temperature control thing, so that if it's sitting there for a while, it doesn't just burn itself up. And if you have a capacity of getting a soldering iron, I recommend that kind if you can manage it. It's more expensive than cheapest possible soldering iron, but it's a lot friendlier. I've spent so much time working with just soldering irons without the thermostat built in, and the kind with the thermostat built in is so much nicer, because all it does is the tip will just end up getting sort of dull eventually, and you just squish it on the sponge with water on it, and it's all shiny and nice and ready to go again. But yeah, what I need to be doing is having that ready, parking it there, having a camera where you can see what I'm working on, and then wiring up whatever. You know, honestly, if I had a camera with autofocus, that'd be the best thing, although I don't have that. But if I did, that would be cool, because then I could be soldering something together here, and if you needed to see it, I'd have a camera like over my shoulder and be like, here, look at that. Certainly some of the things that I'm going to need to do is have enough of a close-up available so that I can solder connections and show you how that's done, because I've seen people soldering on YouTube that did not know what they were doing. And they were doing stuff like, okay, I squish the soldering iron into wherever and then melt some solder off of the soldering iron and drip it onto the thing. And it's like, that ain't how that goes. No. You got to heat the thing up and then touch the soldering iron, the solder to the part that you're connecting. And that's the part that needs to be doing the melting. So it's tricky stuff in its way. But that is definitely part of the plan moving forwards. And some of these plans take a while to get underway, but I'm looking across my room at a stack of perf board that is, because periodically I've just been getting more and more of the stuff, kind of like I get more and more of the parts that I need. And actually the other day, one of the things I tried to do, this would have been great. It didn't work, but it would have been great. Is I tried to get, I think it is CD 4007. I think that's the number, unless it was something else. I don't remember exactly. But there was, and now no longer is, a CMOS part that was shift registers, much like my 4070 shift registers. And where my 4070s, which is the same kind that the Turing machine is based on. There's other stuff to it, by the way, but these are based off of CMOS chips. I have these in quantity, and I can let them go for like 39 cents each or less if I can get them in larger quantity. And the 4007, if I'm remembering the number correctly, is the up to 18 stage shift register where you can only get access to yay many of the output points. Like internally it had, I think, 2 4 stages and 2 5 stage shift registers inside it. So what you would do, and it was implemented in such a way that you could have a shift register number of something like 12, 14, 15, 16, 17, and 18 possible steps. And how this is used is this is the noise generator for the TR-909. There's other ones like it, but that is the chip that generates the hi-hats and such for the Roland 909. That's how that is made, is with that one chip, and it's wired up in a particular way. It's wired up so that it uses a XOR logic gate, and I have those too, to generate a long series of random delays between on and off. It has to start up with at least one positive voltage in the shift register. But then once it does that, it just runs at a really high frequency, like 300 kilohertz, and it just goes. And what you get out of it is white noise. It's 1-bit white noise that is a fairly good approximation of white noise. And that's how some of those digital hi-hats and things are produced, is by generating this sort of digital whine and using the XOR gate. XOR means exclusive OR. It means of these two inputs, the output is high if either one or the other, but not both, is high. And that's an XOR gate, so you patch some of the positions on the outputs of the shift register together so that it's feeding back the end of the shift register into the beginning again. And if you do that, you get the Turing machine or something like it. You get a loop of logic values, and it's clocked with the clock, and it keeps stepping through. You can do stuff like this in VCV Rack as well. It keeps stepping through. So you have your trigger value or whatever, your high logic value, going through step by step till it gets to the end and then getting back to the beginning again. And then the XOR gate is for monitoring a position in the middle of the long loop so that the feedback is a combination of two different points. And if you do that properly, if you set it up just right, what you get is a really good random behavior. The thing is, what was coming to my mind, and this touches on my what do we make concept as well, is if you have a shift register that has like 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 possible delay lengths, to me that just says, wow, okay, that's a rhythm sequencer right there. That, just set it to 16, get a bunch of these chips and let them go. Clock them at 16th notes, and you've got basically your 303 Zoxbox style percussive gate behavior. You've got your 808 and 909 rhythm kind of stuff. And to feed it in, all you got to do is have some kind of little thing to trigger, override the loop section, so that you either are giving it a high voltage and forcing it to be on, or grounding it and forcing it to be off, regardless of what the feedback is trying to do to it. And that's how you do that stuff. You can make, say, a Turing machine, like over here, the Turing machine, with a couple of 4070 chips, because the 4070, if I'm remembering correctly, that, it would be two of, I think it's like an 8-stage shift register. So to get to 16, you need to have 2 chips to do it. But you just set something like that cycling, and then it'll keep cycling at whatever clock it is that you give it, and give you the sequence of outputs. The thing about the Turing machine is that it has a variety of logic and stuff. Like, it's got additional outputs on its little pulses thing where, it's 1 and 2 or 1 and 4. I think it's actually 1 and 2, 2 and 4, 4 and 7, or 1 and 2 and 4 and 7. So there's cascading stages of gates needing to be on. And those are AND gates, so those will trigger less often. And the whole guts of what a Turing machine does is it's doing that, but it's also noisy. So if you set it up and calibrate it just right, you can turn the knob and wind up having new triggers coming in as it cycles, but not constantly. It's mostly cycling, but then there's a whole other circuit there, which is just feeding in something else. And the deal is that doesn't have to be part of the same machine. You could have a input jack that is like, this is the raw input of the gate, and the feedback goes through a resistor. So this jack, if I plug it to logic high voltage, everything is going to be ones going through. And if I ground it, everything's going to be zeros, so you can override it. And by the same token, if you had some switches, then you could have the thing cycling and just play in rhythms. You don't even have to have access to all of the gate outputs at once to do it. You could just be having it play in the rhythms, and it'll do whatever you told it until you tell it to do something else. Or you could have it run by the gate thing again, and just combinations of switches and things to get interesting results. These are the things I come up with when I ask that question of what do we make? Because it's all very well being like, I made another EQ. I made an analog model of this obscure tape machine. Love me. And it's like, why are you doing given things? And it's interesting because the why can be complicated. It can be like this game. Why did you make a game where you've got little balls zipping around that have letters written on them, and you have to type the letter and then steer the thing? It's okay, you can do this. Why did you do it? Because it was an interesting question about how many things you can keep track of at once and how hard it is to accomplish a particular task if you have to quickly get a situation understood. And that doesn't necessarily make it be a game, but it makes it be an interesting exploration into something that poses a difficulty level. And by the same token, talking about the shift registers and stuff, it's like, why would you do that? Because if you were doing electronic music and building your own synthesizer, typically the easiest thing to do there is go, I'm going to make some oscillators. Let's make drones. And you'd make drones. And it goes, and you come up with a bunch of interesting drones, and that's fine. That's also fairly primitive, modular-wise. And you'd begin asking, like, well, what else can I do? Can I make a beat? Okay, let's make one of these. And you do the 4070 shift register and go, I can make a 10-stage sequencer. Actually, it's not I don't think that's the 4070. I think it's something else. But whichever one is the 10-stage sequencer. And you can also make it be an 8-step sequencer. So what you do is go, okay, I got this going. Now I feed a clock to this, and I have a cycling pulse. I can make drums and put those on that. Now I'm doing something that's more closely resembling music. What else can I do? And you go, okay, let's have multiple of these cycles. Do they have to be at the same speed? Can they be going at different speeds and be like polyrhythmic? Or if they're all triggered off of the same speed, do they all have to happen at the same instance? As a matter of fact, no. One of the chips that I've got is a chip that will delay or lengthen a pulse. So that becomes a primitive sort of envelope generator. I can have very brief timing pulses, but I can do a thing where it can lengthen those timing pulses according to what the chip wants to do, meaning that I can have longer notes, or I can maybe control the length of the notes. And that also means if I want to do a snare drum that sounds and feels like a real drummer, I can do that thing where you tell the pulse generator, okay, the pulse is fine, but it needs to happen slower. Put a small delay in. And you have your pulse, and then you put this chip in, this particular chip that I have 100 of, and then that particular sequence is now delayed. If that's on specifically the output that we're using for a snare hit, then that particular hit is now a pulse that's happening instant later. It's sitting in the pocket. It's slower. The snare drum is coming down more slowly, and you could also have a entire, like say you're doing your Turing machine type thing where you don't want to have just a particular one thing. You want to have it randomly generating different pulses and beats. And this is something that I've got this stripped down and partly taken apart because I'm reconfiguring it again. Because I want to be able to drive these different Turing machines off of the drum sequencer, which times them, and have the snare one be slightly delayed, specifically so that I can hit the occasional snare hit, and it doesn't have to be absolutely and totally irregular. In fact, it can come and go. It can be a little bit random. I can have the randomization of the Turing machine start generating stuff like now we're adding a couple of more hits, and now we're taking them away, and now everything has gone away, and now it's starting to come back. But all those hits will sit in the pocket correctly. So that circuit of Turing machine random gate generation would be running off of a slightly delayed clock just because I can do that. I can tell the drum sequencer to do that. But I could also do it with chips. And what we make out of that is the genre that I make when I do music stuff, namely Space House. Namely something where there's a lot of generative aspects to it, but it sits in a zone where it feels kind of like that classic deep house sort of stuff where there's a pulse and it's not unusually robotic and electro and techno-y, but there's a certain flow and groove to it as well. And at the same time, it's being generated by machines. And it's being improvised by machines to the extent that they can do the random stuff and interact with the random stuff. Like here's one of the things that I was doing. The last couple of times I've played, I've patched the Turing machines into each other in a new way. There is a CV control, and the CV control offsets the voltage that is set by the large knob. What that means is, if I'm understanding what it's doing, which I think it is, which I think I am, if the voltage is high on the CV, it turns it clockwise more, which means that from occasionally changing the pattern, it can go to never changing the pattern. So if I have two sequences going at 16 beats per sequence, so they will stay locked, and one of the sequences has like half of its beats on and half of the beats off, and then the other one is blank. What I can do by patching these into each other, and this is the sort of thing where I could make in raw chips, or at least that's what I'm looking to try to learn to do. I'm moving in that direction. If you have them patched into each other in this way so that the output of the one, in addition to driving stuff, like I think what I was actually doing is I was using the out to go into the CV of the other ones because I wasn't using the out for anything else. And if lots of the notes are on, it will produce a digital word that becomes there's another chip which I actually have some of. It's a DAC 800 that is a simple it's a simple 8-bit DAC for taking the output of one of these things and giving us an analog voltage relative to what that would be interpreted as a number. And that's what the out is on these, is that chip producing the output. So what I did was I patched them into each other's CV inputs so that if this one here was generating a lot of notes, causing the CV voltage to be high when the notes were being generated, it would also put that voltage to the CV input of this one, which has the result of turning up the knob and making it not apply any more random notes. So if there were areas where, and you could also do it with simply the outputs of those things, like patch to the output of number 8 or number 4 or something like that into the CV input. And that would mean that, like, as long as the sound is happening here, this other one cannot add a random thing at that moment because it's being suppressed. So in theory, what you would get is patterns from multiple Turing machine sequence generators that interacted with each other so that when the one is playing a bunch of notes, the other one is resting, the other one is not adding notes at the same time. And they would wind up trading off. They would wind up interspersing with each other. And this could be done with a bunch of voltages and wires and less than $1 worth of chips. So if we're talking about good generative stuff, there is certainly the capacity for doing that at any time scale. Like I'm doing it at 16th notes. And it seemed to work too. But if you were doing it on like a measure or a bar per step, what you could do is have the outputs of these sequence generators turning on and off channels on a mixer. And then you would have the random sequence generators starting to fill in spots, but they would tend to resist filling depending upon how you wired them up, depending upon how you wired everything up. I mean, you could run everything through a small voltage mixer or AND gate so that the CV of everything was being driven by the CV controlling the random change of the thing was being driven by the AND gate from the output of all the different possible channels, so that you'd start with like no sound. And everything would be subject to random voltage comes up, and all of a sudden one of the sequencers is producing a voltage high, turning on that channel of the mixer, turning on whatever that instrument is. And oh hey, since the voltage high is also feeding the CVs of everything, that means that now that we have a voltage high, it cannot be further randomized. It's on. That's what you get. And then at any moment when nothing is actually playing, any of the other sequencers could come up with a voltage high and fill in that spot, at which point that one would be muting all the other ones at that spot, and you'd end up with a generative thing where either on a 16th note level or on a bar or measure level, every step of the way, you would have a sort of analog computer that is, and again, you would have to have a random source for all of these things, because that's what the Turing machine has, is it's being fed a random source of some kind, carefully calibrated. I would know because I personally calibrated all of those and made them work. And you can make them so that they trade off. You can make them so that because there's that feedback effect, it makes them be quiet. Oh, but there's more. I did mention how the Turing machine, if you get the Turing machine and the pulses expander and build the kit, and it's a great kit to build. If you're starting to do these, I can't recommend it enough. It's great. That has some logic stuff in there as well. So you can have, 1 and 2, 2 and 4, 4 and 7, and 1 and 2 and 4 and 7. Supposing that 1 and 2 and 4 and 7 is wired to a switch that grounds stuff. So at any point, if you have all of these, if your sequence, as it expands, it keeps cycling through, and every time it cycles through, one or another of these sequencers is adding a step, at which point then the CV control is making it stop the randomness and nothing else can add a step in that spot. Eventually you're going to get to where everything is really dense. And if you have something where the 1 and the 2 and the 4 and the 7 are all active, and you turn on that output voltage, you use that output voltage for a relay or a switch of some kind, and you ground the input of everything. So once you get to that dense point where everything is happening at once, then you start putting in rests. Then you start putting in we've gotten here, therefore all of these sequencers must be silent for this step. With me so far? So we have a system where they're all in lockstep. They're all going to fill in a spot in the overall sequence. It's going to be a different one each time. And then as they get full enough, you wind up having spots cleared back out again when it gets too dense. Now do all of that with sequencers where one is 14 steps, one is 13 steps, one is 15 steps, one is 16 steps, and then one is 17 steps. And see what you get. That's going to be some generative stuff. And when I say, what do we make? Well, this is the kind of stuff that I make. In that it's like, let's do some synthesizer things where the synthesizers are improvising so that I have something to jam along with that's interesting to play with. Then let's build the machines so that they do neat stuff like this, and try to design the system. And try to design it in a way that I could actually build it and have the end result of that. But yeah, let me have a quick look, because we got about a half an hour or so before I'm done with the stream today. I am pleased that Dusan keeps talking about old AMP simulators in the VST format. Well, I keep making some progress on this stuff to the point where I would like to make a new one that's good, but it's a really big task. So I'm doing bits by bits. This is probably why I'm so resistant to putting out those old AMP simulators, is because I feel that I could do so much better by consolidating all the stuff that I'm currently doing now. But by the same token, maybe it might be worth throwing some of those out there. I bet there's some of them that are so simple that I could just do them. And I would have to tell people, this is not current. This is what I did last time. By that I mean a long time ago. And then try to evolve it. But yeah. Yeah, I hear you. People keep clamoring for that. And LeadVox, well, bear in mind, LeadVox is not anything that magical. LeadVox is like Hombre and something else, and it's a small collection of stuff, but I wouldn't call it like revolutionary. Mind you, I think it has some stuff like a simple saturation built into it. That's worth writing down. Let me write that down. That is another possibility. Because you're right, I don't have that as Windows VST yet. Could be worth checking out. Tutorials for Blender. The thing about the idea with that is I would want to be doing stuff as basically sort of shared creative streams. Not so much tutorials and this is how you do this and that, but I'm going to sit down and do lessons and hang out with me while I do it, and let's talk about Blender, or let's talk about working through these various things. That could be interesting. I think I've got Blender 2.83, but I'm not sure. Grease Pencil is, of course, everybody's accessible animation tools, and it might be worth fooling around with... I picked up a really, really, really budget Wacom tablet. I picked up one of the ones that is current and recent, but it's so cheap that the thing doesn't even have an eraser. This is my Wacom stylus, which is fine because I never got used to using an eraser with one anyway, so this is perfect. But Blender, there are some positive things about having some kind of tablet available for it. So that might be also worth exploring. But that's also, people will generally, if you're talking Grease Pencil, that's when people like using styluses and things. And if you're doing animation in the digital form, which is what you can do in Blender, that is certainly something that you might want a tablet for. It's not as easy to draw things with the mouse. Although part of what interests me about animation is the puppeteering. It's the making rigs, making stuff that can be animated that way. Grease pencil is very much more straight ahead animation, and that you're drawing stuff presumably with a stylus, and you're drawing it frame by frame rather than posing something. If you were going to be posing and animating something, it might as well be a 3D object. You're in Blender after all. And I dare say it's very possible to do exactly that. You could probably do stuff with just cards. You can animate something in Blender and just have it be rendered on, quads with images of some kind and do it in that way. But that's part of the fun of it. That's part of the what do we make question. Is this is not really about how do we draw with the stylus in Blender, or how do we animate cards in Blender. Instead, it's like this is the beginning of an explosion. As it gets bigger, and another frame, until it's a ring and then expands outwards. But what if you had a card that was like this and then multiple instances of this, and you're animating, it's transparent, it's just a line on a transparent card. Maybe you're in Blender and you're going, I want to animate my explosion. Rather than draw it frame by frame, I want to take isolated pieces like this and have them expand and like rotate and move position after position, and I would prefer to do it that way. That's how the what do we make question gets into things, because it's like, rather than getting hung up on the details of here's how I make a plugin of a Fairchild 670 limiter. You want one of those, right? They're expensive. Here, have a 670 limiter. It's more like, what are you trying to make the sound do? What are you trying to make as far as the sound is concerned? I ran across a guy on a Facebook group. I don't run any Facebook groups, but there is an Airwindows Audiophiles Facebook group that somebody else runs that I'm quite aware of. And somebody showed up that I enjoyed greatly. As they were going, I thought this was crap for a while, and then I started fooling with it. Now I think that they're extremely exceptional, and these are great. And it's because I'm building new things out of isolated plugins to accomplish the tasks that I want. And I was like, yeah, that's good to hear. That's what I hoped people would do. He's going like, oh, this is my lead vocal chain, and it's this and this and this, and one of these and one of these, and I've got this over here, and it's like running all these things into each other. And I'm like, nice, that's exactly what I had in mind. But part of it is that was for a task. The impression that I got, and how this relates to the what do we make topic, the important thing about that, and what pleased me about seeing this guy doing this thing and saying like, oh, hey, this is great, I didn't get the sense that he sat down going like, what would be a vocal chain? What do I need to do to make a vocal chain? Which plugin should I use for my vocal chain? Instead, he had some kind of performance and went, okay, this needs to be dark and feel like it's sort of in the back of the room because that's my vision for what this is supposed to do. So what do I need to do in order to make it feel dark and like it's in the back of the room? Well, I'll put, I don't know, this distance, and let's put, bright ambience, except for I want dark, so put that in front of distance, or stuff like that. Stuff like, what can I do with these pieces to accomplish the larger concept? And the neat thing about that is if you start doing that in earnest, you can be surprised by unanticipated stuff that starts happening. And then you get the choice of, are you going to resist the unanticipated stuff, or are you going to run with it and make something different? And that's what inspires me about the synthesizer stuff. Granted, I'm doing it in analog, but at some point I'm going to get more into doing it with like raw chips and stuff, and then people can follow along more easily. But the whole idea there is to be able to make something that can generate music, that can make stuff up, that I can go along with or play along with. And then if it starts doing something unexpected, it'll pose a interesting challenge to me that I can follow along and put my energy in. And, we'll end up producing something that I maybe didn't even anticipate, that I maybe didn't even expect to produce. Because that's one of the things. It's like, it's easy to be like, the world needs another Fairchild 670. They're expensive. People can't normally have those, so I need to make a plugin that is a model of a Fairchild 670, blah, blah, blah. And it's easy to communicate stuff like that. But we never wanted a Fairchild 670. We wanted a Beatles vocal. Or we wanted, like, that drum track that was all smashed and super wild and hot and amazing sounding and stuff. It's like we wanted that. We wanted the result. We didn't want the Fairchild 670 part of it. Any way of doing it would be just as good or could accomplish the same kinds of things. And that is the hard stuff. That is the interesting part. In the chat, as I'm looking back onto the chat, Nigel, gotta say, I love your idea. The amazing tool to make for Blender would be a wired or wireless physical model with multi-axis gyros for animation keyframing and to simplify inverse kinematics. And I'm not quite sure what FK is, but it's going to be some kind of kinematics. That's been made. The Clip Studio Paint had access to something called a Mechamo, which was a little physical doll that you would pose to make poses in a 3D model for the purpose of doing it. So you'd have this little posy thing, and then it would tell the internal 3D model how it was going to position itself, and then you'd sketch over that. So, and it didn't sell well enough to keep making it, so they are rare and obscure, and I think only run on Windows and Clip Studio Paint and stuff, and the support is not great for that. But the real purpose is directing something. Do I still? No, I put up some diffusion, so my shelves of things are not there anymore. I'm now looking around, figuring out whether I can label it. Oh no, I know where it is. The thing that I am thinking about is literally right under this desk panel. I'm not going to get it out right now. But it is a music piece. It is a sound engineering piece. It is the Korg Nano Control. The tool that I'd like to see in Blender is bring in MIDI values, and it's going to be about just finding whoever did this and making it, either Blender or, for that matter, Toon Boom. But I'd rather be working in Blender because people can have Blender and you can't really have Toon Boom. It's too expensive. But nano controls are fairly accessible. Not only that, if you really wanted to get crazy, you can take apart a nano control and replace the pots in it with other pots elsewhere, and use the nano control to send in the resulting 8 or 10 different potentiometers along different channels, or different MIDI controller values. So that's the thing, is there's your thing. Rather than needing to make a object that is used to pose things, what you need to do is find the way of doing MIDI in for animation nodes in Blender, find the way of getting the MIDI in, and then have your nano control. Now you've got all these little sliders. Now you're like the puppeteer for Yoda. Now you're going okay, this eyelid is like this, so let's run a pass. And as we run the pass, watch that eyelid and act with it. Move the knob, and the eyelid goes up when you say it is. And then the better you are, the more of these you can control at the same time. If you're a really good puppeteer, you can run several channels at once. You can make a lot of things follow, but it's basically the same thing as doing a mix automation, but it should be possible to do a mix automation with like a nano controller or whatever. And there's a Behringer thing, which is just all knobs, like 16 by 8 by 8, is it? There's a Behringer thing that is like a bank of 8 by 8 knobs, and that also sends MIDI information in. So all you got to have is a class compliant MIDI input device, and then some way of taking in MIDI sequences, or not sequences, that would imply files. MIDI continuous controller values into Blender as a parameter that you can feed into puppeteering. That would be kick butt. It's a little over my head as far as programming stuff is concerned, but Blender's programming is not super inaccessible. I think there's a scripting for it that lets you control the interface and stuff like that. Basically, what you're wanting to do is get MIDI input from a continuous controller that's connected to the computer and route it to something. And if somebody's done this, I would be really surprised if nobody had done this. That seems crazy. It seems so obvious, but sometimes my stuff is like that. Like, it seems to me that it's the most obvious thing in the world, and for some reason nobody's done it, and go figure. But yeah, that would be a really nice addition to Blender, because part of the fun of Blender, besides just modeling things, is animating them. And animating is a big pain in the butt. And if you have to do it all by little mouse motions and fiddling around and stuff, that's tedious. And if you can, like here, there's another thing, which is, I have this little headset. In fact, I'm going to grab it. I'll show you. Check this out. I'm going to put my soldering iron back where it normally lives, having showed that. I got this thing over here. Check this out. I made one of these. Bet you don't have one of these. A little dusty. This is a old Xiaomi Yi action camera. Some of the extra stuff is not necessary, like it's had the lens ripped off of it so that I can refocus it. Otherwise, normally it's just infinite stage of focus. It's got this little fluff on the microphone because this old Yi, its microphone is actually quite good because it's very simple. You can distort it quite easily, but since it doesn't have a lot of built-in compression and stuff, and it's a nice, fairly high-quality little microphone, it gets a pretty decent vocal capture. And the purpose of this is, if you put it on and do a recording of a performance, like this is going to be clearly what I need to screen capture to put as the poster frame for this video. I can tell already. If you do this and then do some kind of performance, and you're talking in you're acting, you're like, I am acting. What you get out of it is the recording of the audio, and I've made some little scripts in FFmpeg that break it down to like 16 frames or 15 frames per second if you want, and delay at the right number of frames to line up, and shrink down the video from the huge size to a little sort of postage stamp size. You then get a video which is the face locked in to the position, and it's a close-up of your face. So in theory, you could take this video output and watch, for instance, like the position of the, and a lot of stuff can do this already, but suppose you have the mouth open. When this spot on the video is the slightly darker color of the inside of my mouth. If you wanted to get really fancy, what you could do is put like white lip gloss on or something like that, so that when your mouth is closed, it's a very bright white color, and then when your mouth is open, it's not. Do something like that, and then map the color of that pixel to the openness of the mouth, and you have self-automating animation. And anybody who knows animation knows that that is a big, big deal. The amount of labor intensity of doing all that kind of stuff is overwhelming. And people do entire YouTube channels that are just them telling stories and talking about things. And they struggle terribly just to make the animations. All they would have to do is do this, capture the video off of that, use the audio, and then take particular areas of the video and map that to like the switch between open and closed mouth, and interpret the pixels of the video image well enough that it can do these basic limited animation things. And then you could talk for 45 minutes into one of these, and it doesn't matter how you move around or whatever, because it's following. It's going to be the exact same pixel. I've already tested this out. It does in fact work. And then you just have your animation rig. Never mind being able to put some kind of thing behind you that's like grayscale, so that you have a head tilt position thing. Do like a red scale and a green scale, where one angle is redness, and that is the amount of rotation, and then one angle is greenness, and that's the amount of vertical pivot, and then you pick a particular pixel in the output, and the degree of redness or greenness gives you the tilt out of your position. And the great thing is this Xiaomi E is like a $70 camera. This is a bicycle helmet, was not expensive. This is aluminum wire. It was not expensive. This is a wing nut. This is a little bolt. This is doable. This is not hard to get together if you're really determined to do it. I put this together and made it work, and it does work. And those are the things that excite me. Is if somebody's, what do we make? If your question for what do we make is, oh, I make 2-hour-long animated videos where it's one of those things where there's an animated character and I'm just talking and it's reacting, but I have no facilities for doing that, and I can't animate 2 hours of footage at 30 frames per second or whatever. So build some kind of rig in Blender with a setup like this and do it that way, and then upload the result. And then you'll be able to upload the results so often that YouTube would even like you, which for any animator is an unthinkable problem. This is the thing. This is the thing, is when asking what do we make, it's never about the devices. Like, I can say, you can make a bicycle helmet with an action cam stuck on it. And it's like, okay, that's fine. Why? Oh, because if you do this, you can run it into Blender, or you can, even if you didn't run it into Blender in the way that you were monitoring colors of pixels and getting variables out of that, what I've already got built for that is the FFmpeg script, where it'll spit out like a 320 by 240 little poster frame that you could bring into anything like that, and then you'd have your voice, and you would have the little reference picture for every single frame of the animation showing you physically how open your mouth is, are you blinking, any of those things, because you'd have the video, the film of, I even came up with a way of doing it where you do this, right? And you do the video, you film the video. And then you take a moment before the video is finished, or at the beginning of the video, after doing all of this kind of stuff, relaxed, no expression face. Then the FFmpeg script that I made takes that and gives you difference from the basic frame. And this would probably be very helpful for the automated stuff I was talking about, but it's also very helpful for if you were hand animating based on this reference. If you have the exact neutral expression, then it becomes a sort of pale gray, nothing much happening. And then all of the expressions that you actually make, everything that's unusual about the pose or about the image, is differenced from the original thing. And so it winds up showing up much more intensely. Blinks, eyebrow raises, you see a double image of the eyebrow and it's clearly different. Or all of these different things. And it's helped by the fact that the camera is held in a fixed position relative to where your head is. So you don't have to track it to some fixed image. It's all being done for you right there. And yeah, that is something that I make because one of the things I've always wanted to get into, in my copious free time as always, is doing some kind of neat animation thing. Doing something that would be really cool and was on a larger scale. And I'm not nearly a good enough artist to be hand drawing animation frames in a beautiful way and making them work. It's like I'm never going to be that guy, but I probably could come up with puppeteering and be able to make something that was at least kind of neat. And then I would need to come up with all of the clever tricks that I could just to get the result made. Because I wouldn't be the guy able to dedicate 10 years of my life to hand animating some kind of film and hope to hell it was good and doesn't just vanish without a thought. Let's see what live chat is up to. It may very well be Behringer X-Touch Mini that the multi-knob thing is. Mile was asking, what do you think of golden ratio in music? I like using golden ratio all the time in coding. I stick it in lots of stuff. In fact, SLU 3 includes golden ratio calculations in it. If you had a look at the code when it went up, you would see that. I think very few people will ever do that, but it's there. And it's a fun way of making stuff be kind of fractal. Like golden ratio of something that is also golden ratio of something that is also golden ratio is like the spiral of a seashell or something like that. I like the way that works for many things, which doesn't mean that it has to be always used for many things, but I just like the way that it works. Bo's coding a Lennon-style dynamic EQ. Cool. Tell us about it when you do it. You have a little bitty audience of just my crew at the Q&A, so you've got some people to look at it anyways. A de-esser with a treble boost. That would be just like a de-esser with a bump in the response, I guess. Oh, we're talking about the Dolby. We're talking about running through the encoder only of the Dolby system. That is a very intense and forthright effect. But yeah, there's bound to be stuff that you can do. And yeah, some of this stuff, things like this, you're absolutely right that it could be useful for musicians for official music videos. I mean, the funny thing about music videos, oh yeah, Euclidean circles, I was very pleased to discover that one. It is also the brightest Eurorack thing that you'd ever saw. It has such bright flashing lights that it makes everything else be like, happy. Official music videos are interesting because the way that works, almost always, you got the guy and they're in the studio and they're delivering a response. You know, they're cutting their track. They're probably contorted all up, delivering their vocal or whatever. And then you shoot the video and they're lip syncing. And they're acting, but the look of somebody delivering a vocal, even like a rock vocal, is typically going to be different than the look of what they looked like when actually tracking the vocal. So it's interesting. The way that you could use something like this for official music videos, particularly if you were animating something, it could very easily be a situation where you're doing the music video, but then you're definitely going to want to do the special version of the track. You put the hat on so that it's watching your face, and then you lip sync because you're focusing on the acting. You're focusing on making the right stuff happen with your face. The noises that you make are really much more irrelevant, but you want to lip sync nice and tight to whatever the actual track was. But it doesn't necessarily benefit you to be looking at exactly how you would have looked when recording the real thing. Instead, it might be much more important to be able to act, to be able to present whatever it is that you're presenting, even if it is in the context of making an animated music video and being able to go through really quickly and pose a puppet based on what you see in the frame that you're working with. And that's even the same thing for if you're doing a film. If you're doing a film, maybe rather than capturing the performances as they're happening for like naturalness, like if you had a couple of different people both wearing these, you'd have to work at synchronizing them, but you would be able to have improv stuff and still capture it in that way. And then if you were doing a film type thing, what you might do is much like in the spaghetti westerns when in James Bond movies, everything was being looped. They're barely ever using raw audio off of the actors' performances. They always went into a studio and like dubbed the voices over with a good microphone and in a more controlled circumstance, and it produces its own kind of effect. So even if it's not a matter of doing a song where you're lip syncing to a song, it could be just as relevant to like do, for instance, a voice actor performance and have that be part of your production. And then when it comes time to do the animation reference, you'd put on your reference thing, but you're not worried so much about capturing every performance well in the rig so you have the exact thing. You might be more concerned about we're looping it, much like with the Sergio Leone or the James Bond or whatever, but instead of looping the voice, you're looping the face acting using something like this. And the sounds that you're making are not nearly as important, but you got to react just right because you're effectively puppeteering whatever it is that you're creating. And it could be anything. It's like, I'm thinking in terms of like, hero characters in animation and being able to do it just right, but you could also have like some freaking transformer or something, or earth-moving machinery, and it reacts in these particular ways, and you just assign stuff to other stuff just about at random. As long as you can interpret it in some way, you can make that work. And the question of what do we make also ties into why we make things. And that's always the goal. It's fun getting sidetracked into like, this is how I make a series of animation reference things. Oh, I made the coolest series of animation reference things. But you kind of want to get down to like, well, what scene did you do? What performance are you actually capturing and putting into some end result thing? Because otherwise you're just making tools to make tools to make tools. So I'm going ahead, but glancing over at the chat again. That's actually where I can see it. I wouldn't be... People with super unique, strong voices to lip sync. Not necessarily. Freddie Mercury would have the easiest time lip syncing, and I'll tell you why. Because he was a master at doubling vocals. Anybody that can double vocals can lip sync wonderfully. And I'll tell you who did not have an easy time. Aretha Franklin. Aretha Franklin was on the Blues Brothers movie. And so she had to lip sync in order to perform on set for the camera with the pre-existing stuff that was built into the... And she had enormous trouble doing it because Aretha improvised stuff so much. All the spontaneous things that she did, certainly in this movie and stuff. I can't remember whether she's still with us. But her spontaneity has been amazing. But she was not a person to be able to go and double a performance. You need to be able to double a performance or just nail it down really, really tightly in order to be able to lip sync brilliantly. And if your whole thing, another possibility might be, for instance, the guy that might have a difficulty lip syncing could be Joe Cocker. Old 60s performer Joe Cocker, because again, there is a spontaneity there. Or Van Morrison. Van Morrison was also gifted with the ability to be extremely spontaneous, but there is a price to that. Meaning if you were that based upon being spontaneous, then reproducing exactly what you've done is a completely different story. It's kind of like Steve Vai doing a guitar part that exactly duplicated what Frank Zappa's voice did in a weird, spontaneous improvisation, and having that be the art piece is... and that would be off of the Man from Utopia album. The Dangerous Kitchen is a wonderful example there, where you had Zappa doing a goofy meltdown, weird, silly vocal. And then in the studio afterwards, you go, okay, play that. And Steve Vai, on a guitar, would play that. He played the exact intonation. He would play the dynamics and all the syllables with little guitar notes, and the pitches would be exactly right, even though there was not equal temperament pitches. Doesn't matter. Steve Vai has a whammy bar and bends notes. And the end result would be doubling something that was just about undoubleable. So yeah, as far as lip syncing and doing stuff like that, it is a matter of how thought out the thing was in the first place. I tend to favor stuff that's pretty thought out, that you could double or triple or whatever, because it's meant to go in a very specific way. But there's folks that would improvise much more wildly around stuff, and if they're so based on that that's all they do, they would tend to have difficulty doubling parts or lip syncing. or performing with a rig like this so that they could have an animated character apparently doing the performance. Because to do that, they would either have to be doing it into this in the first place, or they would have to be doubling their part perfectly. And on that note, I'm going to start winding this down before I go over 2-hour mark. So what I will say is I will talk to you guys later. Most likely, the next thing we're going to see, plugin-wise, is the new version of Channel. The version of Channel where the high-pass aspect of it uses what Capacitor does, and the slew clipping aspect goes from the equivalent of the original slew to slew 3. Hopefully that's going to be good. I would encourage experimenting with slew 3 at very low settings to see whether it tends to sound nice or whether you've got situations where it suddenly sounds terrible. I don't really anticipate that, but if it posed a huge problem, I'd have to revisit my plans for the new channel. But I've got that going on, and that should be next week. And I will catch up with you guys next week, and we'll have another Q&A, and we'll see what we can get together, moving into the winter and coming up with our projects and things to do. So I'll talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.